time does not stop. We may feel that it does in moments of shock or grief or extraordinary wonder, but time does not stop. It is the one thing in this universe that has never once, in the 4 billion years of this planet's existence, paused for anything. Not for a king's death, not for a lover's last breath, not for the moment when a great man's hands go still upon his workbench. Time does not stop. Clocks, however, do. And what a clock stopped at the wrong moment can tell you, if you know how to read it, is more than most men learn in a lifetime. Welcome to the 7th audiobook in the Sherlock Holmes series, written by Reginald Musgrave for Omniversal Editions. This time in English, for all those who love their mysteries in the language in which Holmes himself thought and spoke and reasoned. The story you are about to hear is called The Clockmaker's Last Second. It is, in my estimation, the most precisely constructed mystery in this series. Fitting, perhaps, for a story about the most precisely constructed objects in Victorian London. It is a story about time, about what we use it for, and about what happens when someone decides that another man's time has simply run out. The Clockmaker's Last Second, a Sherlock Holmes adventure. As narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. Omniversal Editions. Reginald Musgrave. The Clockmaker's Last Second, a Sherlock Holmes adventure. Every mechanism, however complex, has a point at which it can be stopped. The art is in finding it or in hiding it. Sherlock Holmes, November 1898. To those who measure time, not in seconds, but in what is made of them. R.M. Chapter 1. The Clocks of Clerkenwell. The district of Clerkenwell has always had a peculiar relationship with time. In the narrow streets between Clerkenwell Road and St. John's Lane, the trade of clockmaking has flourished since the 17th century, filling the air with a sound that is unlike any other in London. A dense, layered ticking that on certain quiet afternoons becomes almost architectural, as if the district itself were built not from brick and stone, but from accumulated seconds. I had occasion to visit Clerkenwell the previous autumn on a matter unrelated to any of Holmes's cases, and I remember standing for a moment in the street outside one of the larger workshops, struck by the curious feeling that time moved differently there. Not slower, not faster, but with a self-awareness that the rest of the city lacked. As if Clerkenwell knew exactly what it was doing with every minute. It was from Clerkenwell that Holmes's telegram arrived on the morning of the 14th of November, 1898. I had spent the night at Baker Street. Holmes had been in one of his more bearable phases of inactivity, which manifested as a sustained interest in the chemistry of rust that had produced several interesting smells but no dangerous experiments. And I was at the breakfast table when Mrs. Hudson brought up the wire. Holmes was already in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes fixed on some middle distance that contained more information than the actual room. "Watson," he said, without moving, "how would you describe your current caseload?" "Non-existent, as you well know." "Capital. Then you have no objection to a brief excursion to Clerkenwell." He rose, and was already in motion towards the coat rack before I had opened the telegram. "Leave that. I'll tell you on the way. Bring the medical bag. And Watson." He paused at the door, with that particular quality of stillness that meant something genuinely unusual was waiting. "Bring your watch. You'll want to compare it." In the cab, Holmes told me what Lestrade had told him in the telegram, which was this. Cornelius Fitch, aged 61, master clockmaker of international renown, had been found dead that morning in his workshop at number 47 Clerkenwell Road. The workshop was locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of violent struggle, and no apparent cause of death beyond a man who appeared to have simply stopped, much like his clocks. "His clocks," I said. "Every clock in the workshop," said Holmes. 237 of them, according to Lestrade's count, which I suspect is approximate. Every single one has stopped, and every single one has stopped at the same time." "How is that possible?" "That," said Holmes, with the precise containment of a man who is enjoying a problem more than he is willing to admit, "is what we are going to find out." Clerkenwell Road in November wore the grey coat of a London autumn, the plane trees stripped to their bones, the cobblestones dark with last night's rain, the gas lamps still burning in the mid-morning fog that had not yet decided to lift. Number 47 was a narrow-fronted Georgian building of 3 stories, with a brass sign on the door that read simply, Fitch, Horological Instruments. The sign was polished to a brightness that seemed almost defiant in the general gloom. Lestrade was on the pavement with 2 constables, and the expression of a man who has seen enough strange things in his career to be suspicious of strangeness but not yet immune to it. He shook Holmes's hand with something close to relief. "Mr. Holmes, thank you for coming quickly. This one is... well, you'll see." "The clocks first," said Holmes. "Before the body, before anything else, I need to see the clocks." Lestrade blinked. "The clocks." "The clocks," Holmes confirmed, and went in. The workshop occupied the entire ground floor and a portion of the basement. I have tried, in various drafts of these notes, to find the right words for what it looked like that morning, and have repeatedly failed. Not because the language is insufficient, but because the effect was not primarily visual. It was temporal. 237 stopped clocks produce a silence that is different from ordinary silence. It is the absence not merely of sound, but of movement, of the particular kind of movement that clocks perform, and that we absorb so unconsciously into our sense of a living space that we only notice it when it is gone. Every clock had stopped at 11:47. Grandfathers with pendulums frozen mid-swing. Mantel clocks with hands pointing at the same angle, like a regiment ordered to halt. Glass-domed carriage clocks, their balance wheels motionless. A row of bracket clocks along the far wall, their silence as absolute as the silence of a church between services. And on the central workbench, surrounded by tools and springs and the dense litter of a craftsman's daily work, the display case. Velvet-lined, empty. Holmes walked slowly through the room, 3 times, in different directions, without speaking. I followed at a distance, watching him watch things. It was, as always, like observing an instrument of extraordinary precision, performing a calibration that would be meaningless to describe to someone who did not already understand the instrument. On his 3rd circuit, he stopped at the central workbench and looked at the empty case for a long time. "Lestrade," he said. "The celestial engine." "Gone," said Lestrade. Whatever it was. It was Fitch's masterpiece. The most complex astronomical clock built in England in the last 2 centuries, 6 months in the making. It could calculate the precise position of every planet in the solar system, the inclination of the ecliptic, the perturbations of the outer planets, the dates of future eclipses, to within a margin of error of less than 3 seconds per century. He paused. It was worth, at a conservative estimate, £4,000, at an accurate estimate, considerably more. "That explains the robbery, then," said Lestrade. "Does it?" Holmes turned away from the case and looked at the stopped clocks. "Then explain the clocks." Chapter 2. The Workshop of the Dead. Cornelius Fitch lay in the small back room adjacent to the workshop. A combination of private office and sitting room that served as the domestic space of a man who had evidently long since ceased to distinguish between living and working. He was in his chair, not at his desk, but in the armchair by the cold fireplace, in the position of someone who had sat down for a moment and found that the moment had no end. He was wearing his work clothes, the leather apron, the magnifying loupe still strapped to his forehead. On the arm of the chair, a cup of tea, cold and untouched. On the small table beside it, a notebook open to the last entry. Holmes read the notebook entry before I had finished my examination of the body. He read it twice, standing with the book held close to the single gas lamp that Lestrade had lit to supplement the dim light from the frosted window. "Watson, when you have finished." I straightened up. Fitch had died of cardiac arrest, as far as I could determine without a full post-mortem. But there was something in the coloration of the skin and in the dilation of the pupils that made me want to qualify that immediately. "I'd want a toxicologist to look at this before I commit to natural causes," I said. "As would I. Tell me your specific concern." "The pupils. In a cardiac death, the pupils are typically fixed and mid-dilated. Fitch's are slightly more dilated than I would expect, suggesting the possible involvement of a substance that acted on the nervous system, something that might have accelerated an event that was going to happen anyway, or triggered it prematurely. A man of his age with his build, Holmes said, looking at Fitch's heavy frame and the ruddy complexion even in death that spoke of decades of poor circulation. Was probably not far from a natural cardiac event in any case. Which is exactly the point, I said. If someone wanted his death to appear natural, they chose the right man. A drug that would tip him over the edge of an event that was coming regardless would be almost impossible to trace without knowing what to look for. Holmes set the notebook down and turned his attention to the cold fireplace. The grate contained ash. Not the old ash of a fire burned down naturally, but the specific ash of paper burned in a hurry. Light, flaky, with edges that still held the ghost of folded shapes. Someone burned correspondence here, I said. Recently. Within the last 12 hours, the paper is thin and of good quality, not a bill or a newspaper, a letter or several letters. Holmes crouched and examined the ash with his lens. One fragment is recoverable. He extracted it with tweezers and held it to the lamp. A piece no larger than a visiting card, with 4 words still legible in what appeared to be a strong, educated hand. I leaned to look. The words were, "The engine must never..." "The engine must never," I repeated. "Never be sold? Never be delivered? Never be seen?" Holmes placed the fragment carefully in an envelope from his pocket. The celestial engine was commissioned by an anonymous client. It was, by Lestrade's account, very nearly complete, and someone, either the client or someone acting against the client, wanted it kept from its intended destination. The client commissioned it, then had Fitch killed before the delivery. Or someone else had Fitch killed to prevent the delivery. The distinction matters enormously. Holmes rose and returned to the workshop, where the silence of 237 stopped clocks was beginning to feel less atmospheric and more like an argument. I followed him. He stood at the center of the room, turning slowly, examining the clocks, not as a collection, but as individual objects. "Watson," he said, "do you notice anything about the positions of the pendulums?" I looked. The pendulums of the grandfather clocks, there were 11 of them along the north wall, were all frozen in their arcs. But now that he drew my attention to it, I saw what he meant. They were not all frozen in the same position. Some were at the leftmost extent of their swing, some at the right, some in the middle. "They stopped at the same time on the clock face," I said slowly, "but at different points in their physical cycle." "Exactly. If a single shock, a sound, a vibration, a sudden change in air pressure, had stopped all the pendulums simultaneously, they would have stopped wherever the shock caught them, which is what we see." Holmes moved to the nearest grandfather clock and studied its mechanism closely. The clocks were not stopped by someone moving through the room, resetting each one individually. They were stopped by a single event. Something that propagated through the room in a fraction of a second and interrupted every mechanism at once. What kind of event could do that? Holmes looked up at the ceiling, then at the walls, then at the floor. His gaze settled on the workbench. "Something that Fitch himself built," he said quietly. "Something that was activated from within this room, or was set to activate automatically, and something that we haven't found yet." Chapter 3. The Celestial Engine. In the years since I first began chronicling Holmes's investigations, I've occasionally been accused of exaggerating the range of his knowledge. Readers who know him only through my published accounts sometimes write to suggest that no single man could possess expertise in chemistry, in music, in soil composition, in criminal psychology, in the ash of different tobaccos, and in the dozens of other fields that have proved relevant to various cases. These readers are not wrong to be skeptical. What they fail to understand is that Holmes's knowledge is not encyclopedic in the way of a generalist. It is strategic. He knows precisely what he needs to know, when he needs to know it, and nothing else. Horology was one of his areas of deep specific competence. I had discovered this once before, in a case that never reached publication, when he had identified the forgery of a will partly through his recognition that the clock referenced in the document could not have shown the time the witness described, given its particular escapement mechanism. He had not seemed especially interested in clocks as objects. He had seemed interested in what they could tell him, which is a different thing entirely. Standing in Fitch's silent workshop, Holmes began to tell me about the celestial engine. Fitch spent 40 years refining the principles of the astronomical clock. he said, moving from case to case as he spoke, examining each instrument briefly before moving on. His early work was shown at the Great Exhibition of 1862. He was 19 years old, and the clock he exhibited was already more precise than anything produced by the Royal Clockmakers. He spent the following decades in Clerkenwell, taking commissions from governments, from observatories, from the great houses. He turned down a position at the Greenwich Observatory because it would have required him to share his methods. A secretive man. A proud man. There is a difference, though the results can be similar. Holmes paused at a workbench near the back wall, where a series of sketches was pinned. Technical drawings of extraordinary complexity, covered in annotations in a small, precise hand. These are the working drawings for the celestial engine, or part of them. I looked over his shoulder. The drawings showed interlocking gear trains of labyrinthine complexity, with notations regarding tooth counts and ratios that meant nothing to me, but that Holmes studied with an absorption that told me they were telling him something considerable. "Remarkable," he said after several minutes. "What is?" "The secondary mechanism." He pointed to a detail in the lower right of one drawing. A separate gear train, apparently isolated from the main astronomical mechanism, with its own drive spring. "This has nothing to do with calculating planetary positions. It is a different kind of clock entirely. Much simpler, much faster. A countdown mechanism." "Countdown to what?" "To something that happens once, at a precise moment, and does not repeat." Holmes straightened. "I believe, Watson, that the celestial engine contained two machines. The first was what Fitch told everyone it was. An astronomical masterpiece. The second was something built into it secretly. A mechanism designed to perform a single action at a predetermined time." "What action?" Holmes was quiet for a moment. "Do you recall my observation about the clocks? That they were stopped by a single event that propagated through the room in a fraction of a second?" "Yes." "A powerful electromagnetic pulse generated by the sudden discharge of a charged coil could stop every mechanical clock in a room of this size simultaneously. The pendulums, the balance wheels, the escapements, all would freeze in their tracks at the instant of the discharge." He looked at the empty display case on the central workbench. The celestial engine contained such a coil. It was the countdown mechanism, set to discharge at precisely 11:47 on the night of the 13th of November. When it discharged, it stopped every clock in the workshop, and it also... He stopped. "It also killed Fitch," I said, understanding reaching me with a certain chill. The discharge was powerful. Fitch was in the adjoining room. The electromagnetic effect would have been diminished by the wall, but for a man of his age and his cardiovascular condition, the shock of the pulse at close range, the sudden disruption to his heart's own electrical rhythm, could easily have been the trigger for a fatal arrhythmia. Holmes looked at the doorway between the workshop and Fitch's sitting room. "Not a poison, Watson. Not a drug. A machine. Fitch was killed by a clock." The silence of the workshop seemed to acquire a new dimension. "His own clock," I said. His own clock. Built into the object that he was most proud of, that he had spent 6 months creating, that he had been looking forward to delivering. Holmes's voice was quiet, and without any of the usual notes of intellectual satisfaction that accompanied a discovery. "Whoever commissioned the celestial engine specified not only the astronomical mechanism, but the hidden one. And Fitch, who built the secondary mechanism because he was asked to, without fully understanding its purpose, built his own death into the machine with the same precision he applied to everything else he made." Chapter 4. The client who was never there. The notebook that Fitch had kept beside his chair yielded more than I had initially hoped. Holmes spent the cab journey back to Baker Street, reading it with the focused attention of a man who knows that the shape of another man's daily life contains, if one knows how to read it, more information than any confession. He read it twice through, then handed it to me. Fitch's notebook was a record of his work. Not a diary in the personal sense, but the professional journal of a craftsman. Materials ordered, techniques tried, measurements recorded, appointments noted. The entries were terse but consistent, and they covered the last 8 months of his life. The celestial engine appeared first on the 5th of May under the heading New Commission. Anon, client. Delivered by representative. Specs attached. The specifications, which Holmes found clipped to the back pages, ran to 6 dense sheets of technical requirements. Holmes had already read them. The client, I said, reading through the notebook, never came in person. Everything was communicated through an intermediary. A man who called himself Mr. Croft, Holmes confirmed. Described by Fitch in his notes as tall, well-dressed, good English but foreign intonation, perhaps Austro-Hungarian, visited 4 times over the course of the commission, brought payments in cash. And Fitch never met the actual client. Never, and I suspect, from this passage. Holmes leaned over and pointed to an entry from the 3rd of October. That Fitch began to feel uneasy about the commission in its later stages. Read the entry. I read, 3rd visit from C, pressed again, RE, secondary mechanism, explained function once more. C seemed satisfied. Cannot see the purpose of an EM discharge coil in an astronomical instrument. Client's explanation, experimental time synchronization, seems technically implausible. I'm beginning to wonder if I should ask more questions. He suspected something, I said. He suspected something but was paid too well to act on the suspicion. £4,000 was the agreed price, double his previous largest commission. And Fitch was 61 years old, Watson, with no apprentice, no family, and the workshop's lease due for renewal in January. £4,000 was security. It was enough to make a man overlook questions he would otherwise have asked. And the secondary mechanism? Fitch built what he was asked to build. He was told it was for experimental purposes, synchronizing clocks across a large building using an electromagnetic pulse, the client claimed. Technically possible, technically coherent, just implausible as a reason to put such a mechanism inside an astronomical clock. But Fitch was a clockmaker, not a physicist. He built it because it was within his technical competence and because he was paid to. Holmes rose and moved to the window. Baker Street was beginning its afternoon business below. The usual traffic of cabs and carts and pedestrians going about the irreducible complexity of a city's day. The question is not what the mechanism was designed to do. We know what it did. The question is what the celestial engine was designed to do after it left this workshop. I looked up from the notebook. What do you mean? The electromagnetic discharge destroyed the workshop's clocks. It killed Fitch. But the engine was taken before the discharge, removed from its case sometime before 11:47. Holmes turned from the window. Someone took the engine out of the workshop before it discharged, which means that someone knew exactly when the discharge was scheduled. The client, I said. Or the intermediary. Or someone who had access to the specifications, the same specifications that told Fitch when to set the countdown. Holmes moved to the desk and began writing rapidly. I need to find Mr. Croft, and I need to understand why the celestial engine, now stripped of its deadly secondary mechanism, presumably was valuable enough to someone that they would kill for it. An astronomical clock worth £4,000, I said. An astronomical clock that can calculate the precise position of every planet, every satellite, every celestial body for 1,000 years, Holmes corrected. Watson. What kind of person needs to know with that degree of precision where celestial bodies will be at a given future date? I thought about it. An astronomer, an observatory. Or a navigator, said Holmes. Or a military strategist planning an operation that depends on tidal conditions, on the phases of the moon, on the exact moment of sunrise over a particular stretch of coastline. He sealed the letter he was writing. I believe the celestial engine was never intended for a gentleman's study. I believe it was ordered by a government. And I believe it was not our government. Chapter 5. The Apprentice's Hands. Holmes had telegraphed Mycroft before we left Clerkenwell, and the reply arrived at Baker Street within 2 hours. A speed of response that always impressed me, given that Mycroft Holmes's official position bore no clear relationship to the intelligence resources he apparently commanded. The telegram was characteristically concise. Croft. Almost certainly Georg Weiss, Commercial Attaché, Austro-Hungarian Embassy, seconded from Military Intelligence, currently in London. Fitch's celestial engine matches specification requested by Imperial Naval Observatory, Vienna, in confidential procurement exercise 1897. That procurement was interrupted. Their agent disappeared. Someone else picked up the commission.
Come to the Diogenes at your convenience. M. Holmes read the telegram once and set it down with the precise care of someone handling something that has suddenly become considerably more significant. The Imperial Naval Observatory, I said.
The Austro-Hungarian Navy has a problem, said Holmes. Their charts of the Adriatic, their astronomical tables for the calculation of tidal conditions along certain coastlines, are dangerously out of date. A new astronomical clock of the precision Fitch could provide would give them a strategic advantage in naval planning that they currently lack. He moved to his chair. The question is not why they wanted it. The question is who intercepted their procurement process, had Fitch killed and took the engine for themselves. Another government? A government, or an organization operating independently of any government. Someone who knew about the Vienna procurement, who had the technical sophistication to understand the secondary mechanism's function, and who had the operational reach to place an agent in Clerkenwell 6 months ago. Before Holmes could continue, Mrs. Hudson announced another visitor. The young man who entered was perhaps 25, with the careful hands of a craftsman and the slightly unfocused eyes of someone who has been awake for a very long time. He gave his name as Thomas Hale and identified himself as having been Fitch's assistant for the past 3 years. "I heard this morning," he said, sitting on the edge of the offered chair with the rigid posture of someone maintaining composure through sheer will. "I wasn't in the workshop. It's my day off on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. I came as soon as I heard." "You worked on the celestial engine," said Holmes. It was not a question. Hale looked startled anyway. "Yes, the final 6 months. I did the gear cutting for the main train. Mr. Fitch cut the planetary cams himself, but I did the supporting work." "And the secondary mechanism?" A pause. Hale's hands tightened slightly on his knees. "Mr. Fitch did that alone. He didn't want me involved in it. He said it was the client's specification, and it was to be kept between himself and Mr. Croft." "But you knew it was there." "I saw it once when I came into the workshop unexpectedly. Mr. Fitch covered it quickly. He was embarrassed, I think. He knew I'd have questions about it." "What did you see?" "A coil, wound very tightly. More wire than I'd ever seen used in a clock component. It was connected to the main drive spring through an escapement I didn't recognize. Something Mr. Fitch had designed himself." Hale paused. "I asked him about it afterwards, and he told me it was for experimental synchronization. I didn't believe him, but he was my employer, and it wasn't my place." Holmes leaned forward. "Hale, did you ever have any direct contact with Mr. Croft? Any conversation with him that Fitch was not present for?" Another pause. Longer this time, with something in it that Holmes and I both noticed. "Once," Hale said, "about 3 weeks ago. Mr. Fitch was at the suppliers. Croft came to the workshop. He said he was there to check on progress. But he spent more time looking at the secondary mechanism than at the astronomical work. He asked me several questions about its current state." "What questions?" "Whether the coil was fully wound, whether the countdown had been set, whether Mr. Fitch had mentioned the discharge date to anyone else." Holmes sat back. "And had he?" "Not that I knew of, but—" Hale stopped. "Continue." "The day before yesterday, Sunday, I came to the workshop to collect some tools I'd forgotten. Mr. Fitch was there working late, which wasn't unusual, but there was someone with him, not Croft. Someone I'd never seen. A woman." Holmes's attention sharpened perceptibly. "Describe her." 40, perhaps 45, dark hair, well-dressed. She spoke in a low voice, and I couldn't make out her words. I only heard Mr. Fitch's reply, which was, "I understand, I'll have it ready." And then she left. She passed close to me in the doorway. She knew I was there, I think, but she didn't acknowledge me. "Did you see her face clearly?" "Yes. She had a scar above her left eyebrow. A small one, but distinctive." Holmes rose. "Thank you, Mr. Hale. Please do not return to the workshop until you hear from Lestrade or from me.
And please do not discuss this conversation with anyone." When Hale had gone, Holmes stood at the window for a long moment. "A woman," I said.
A woman who arrived 2 days before the discharge, spoke to Fitch and extracted a commitment from him. "I'll have it ready." Ready for what? And for whom? Is what I intend to find out before the day is out. You recognize her description? Holmes turned from the window. "I do. And if I am right about who she is, Watson, this case reaches considerably further than Clerkenwell." He took his coat from the rack. "Come, we are going to the Diogenes Club." Chapter 6. The second mechanism. Mycroft Holmes, settled in his chair at the Diogenes Club with the permanence of a geological feature, listened to his brother's account of the morning with his eyes half closed. Not from inattention, but from the particular quality of focus that allowed him to process information at a rate that most human beings never approached. When Holmes had finished, Mycroft opened his eyes fully and said, "The woman with the scar. You know her?" "I know of her. She uses several names. The one most frequently in use in London at present is Mrs. Eleanor Strand. She is, as best our intelligence can determine, an independent operative. Not attached to any government service, though she has worked for at least 3 over the past decade. She specializes in the acquisition and movement of technical objects, precision instruments, scientific equipment, items of strategic value that governments want but cannot be seen to want." "A broker," I said. "A highly sophisticated one. She does not steal. She arranges. She identifies objects that multiple parties want, cultivates relationships with the creators of those objects, and manages the transactions that move the objects from one set of hands to another. The secondary mechanism in the celestial engine?" "She specified it," said Holmes. "Almost certainly. The original Austro-Hungarian Commission did not include any electromagnetic component. When their procurement was interrupted, when Weiss, their agent, disappeared, someone stepped in. Someone who had been monitoring the original commission and who had their own plans for the engine. Mrs. Strand offered Fitch the same commission at twice the price, with an additional requirement: the secondary mechanism." "Which killed Fitch," Holmes said. Mycroft was quiet for a moment. "I don't believe Mrs. Strand intended Fitch to die. The electromagnetic discharge was designed to stop the clocks, to create an effect that would confuse the investigation, destroy any timing evidence, and make the time of the theft unclear. Fitch's cardiac arrest was, I suspect, what she would call collateral consequence. She miscalculated his condition, or chose not to factor it in, which amounts to the same thing." Mycroft pressed his fingertips together. "The celestial engine, without its secondary mechanism, is now in transit to its final buyer. We have approximately—" He glanced at the clock on the mantel. 36 hours before it leaves English soil. After that, recovery becomes a matter for diplomacy rather than detection." Holmes stood. "Where is Mrs. Strand now?" "We believe she's in a private house in Kensington. I can give you the address." Mycroft paused. "Sherlock, Mrs. Strand is not a violent woman. Her method is arrangement, not force, but the people she works for are not always equally restrained. Take care." "Watson," said Holmes, "you brought your revolver." It was not a question. "As a matter of course," I said. "Good." He took the address from Mycroft and was already moving toward the door. "Lestrade, tell him to meet us at the Kensington address in 1 hour. Not before. I want to speak with Mrs. Strand first." "Sherlock." 1 hour, Mycroft." Holmes paused at the door. "And tell me one thing. Who is the buyer?" Mycroft looked at his brother with an expression that contained something I could only describe as concern, which on Mycroft Holmes's face had the same effect as panic on anyone else's. "That," he said, "is the part I have not yet confirmed, and it is the part that makes me most anxious." Holmes nodded once, and went out. Chapter 7. The Embassy Connection. The house in Kensington was a well-maintained terrace property, indistinguishable from its neighbours, except for the slight excess of net curtaining in the front windows. A detail that Holmes noted as we approached and which apparently told him something because he altered his approach angle without comment. He knocked at the door with the brisk confidence of a man paying an expected social call. After a moment, the door opened. Mrs. Eleanor Strand was, as Hale had described, a woman of 40 or so, with dark hair and the bearing of someone who had spent years in rooms where the wrong word could have significant consequences and had learned to carry herself accordingly. The scar above her left eyebrow was small and neat, the kind left by a clean cut rather than a rough injury. She looked at Holmes for a half-second, and in that half-second I saw the rapid calculation of someone assessing a situation from multiple angles simultaneously. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I expected you somewhat earlier." "My apologies for the delay," said Holmes, stepping inside. "I had to verify several details before this conversation would be productive." She led us to a sitting room that had the quality of a space prepared for a specific purpose. Not quite a trap, not quite a neutral meeting ground, but something in between. 2 chairs had been placed facing each other, with a small table between them. A tray of tea things. The ordinary social mechanics of a conversation that both parties knew was not going to be ordinary. Mrs. Strand sat. Holmes sat. I stood by the door, which seemed the appropriate arrangement. "Fitch is dead," said Holmes. "I know," she said. She did not look away. "I am sorry for it. It was not intended. You miscalculated his cardiac condition. I was given incorrect information about his health. The person who assessed him for me told me the electromagnetic discharge at that distance and through that wall would produce at most a minor arrhythmia, sufficient to leave him disoriented and unable to pursue the matter effectively, but not fatal." A pause. "I was deceived about that, as it happens, as I was deceived about several other things in this arrangement." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "The buyer." Something changed in Mrs. Strand's expression. Not fear exactly, but a recalibration. "I was given to understand that the celestial engine was intended for a private scientific institution in Switzerland. I conducted due diligence. The institution exists. Its interest in precision astronomical instruments is genuine." She paused. "It was only in the last week that I discovered the arrangement had layers I was not informed of. The Swiss institution is genuine, but it is a pass-through. The actual final destination—" "The Russian Imperial Navy," said Holmes. A long silence. "Yes," said Mrs. Strand. "I believe so, though I have no direct confirmation. The Russian Baltic Fleet has been calculating its operations for the past 3 years using astronomical tables that are demonstrably inaccurate at the level of arc-seconds. An engine of Fitch's precision would give them a capability that—" Holmes stopped. "Where is the engine now?" "In a warehouse in Wapping. It leaves for Hamburg tomorrow morning on the 7 o'clock steam packet. From Hamburg it goes to Kiel, and from Kiel—" "It never reaches Kiel," said Holmes. He rose. "Mrs. Strand, you will accompany us to Scotland Yard, where you will give Inspector Lestrade a complete account of the arrangement, the intermediaries, the warehouse location, and everything else that is relevant. In exchange, I will recommend to my brother that the Crown treat your cooperation with the appropriate acknowledgement." She regarded him steadily. "And if I decline?" "Then the celestial engine leaves for Hamburg at 7 tomorrow morning, and we have a rather more complicated problem on our hands. And you go to Lestrade anyway, with somewhat less credit attached." Another pause. Shorter this time. "Very well," said Mrs. Strand. "I will need 15 minutes. "You have 10, said Holmes. Chapter 8. The Last Winding. The warehouse in Wapping was located near the north bank of the Thames, between 2 larger commercial buildings, with a rusted iron door that had been recently fitted with a new lock. The kind of inconsistency that Holmes always found more revealing than a fully consistent scene. Lestrade arrived with 4 officers at 9:30 that evening. Holmes had insisted on going ahead with only me for company, which Lestrade had objected to, and Holmes had overridden with the argument that the advance party needed to be small enough to enter without being detected before the police contingent secured the exits. We entered through a window on the riverside. Holmes had identified it during an approach by river taxi as the one point where the building's watchman's circuit had a gap. The window was unfastened. Holmes went through it first. I followed. and we stood in darkness with the sound of the Thames just audible through the walls. Holmes produced a small dark lantern from his coat and opened the shutter a crack. The warehouse resolved itself around us. Stacked crates, the smell of sawdust and machine oil, a narrow passage between piles of stored goods leading toward the center of the building. At the center, on a trestle table, the celestial engine. Even in the limited light of the dark lantern, it was extraordinary. It occupied a space roughly the size of a large writing desk, a towering, delicate architecture of brass and steel with gear trains of incredible intricacy arranged around a central orrery whose planets moved on their inclined planes with a precision that the mechanical drawings had only suggested. It was still running, I realized. The astronomical mechanism was still calculating, the planetary indicators still tracking their infinitesimal courses, silent and perfect in the darkness of the warehouse. The display case for the secondary mechanism was empty, as Holmes had predicted. Removed before the discharge, sold separately perhaps to a buyer who understood its application. Holmes examined the engine for 3 minutes, moving carefully around it, the lantern close to the mechanisms. Then he straightened and said very quietly, "There is someone else here." I had heard nothing, but I drew my revolver. The man who stepped out from behind the stacked crates at the far end of the warehouse was not what I had expected. Not a guard, not an operative, but a man of perhaps 50 in good clothing with the careful posture of someone managing extreme tension. He held a small pistol in his right hand, aimed at Holmes with the precision of someone who knew how to use it, but would rather not. Holmes did not move. "Georg Weiss," he said. The man stiffened. "You know me." Mycroft's telegram mentioned that the original Austro-Hungarian agent had disappeared. "I expected you to reappear in the vicinity of the object you were sent to acquire." Holmes's voice was entirely calm. That specific calmness that he maintained in situations of genuine danger, which was less like tranquility and more like perfect control. "You have been following Mrs. Strand's operation from the beginning, waiting for the engine to reach a recoverable position." "It belongs to Vienna," Weiss said. "It was commissioned by Vienna. It was stolen from Vienna's agent by Mrs. Strand and sold to—" "I know who it was sold to," said Holmes. "And so do you, which is why you are here." A pause. "Lower the pistol, Mr. Weiss. The Strad has the building surrounded and I have Dr. Watson at my back with a considerably larger firearm. This conversation has already determined the engine's immediate future, which is that it goes neither to Hamburg nor to Vienna tonight, but to a room in Scotland Yard while the diplomatic questions are sorted out." He paused. "I am afraid bureaucracy is going to have to take its turn." Weiss looked at Holmes for a long moment. Then he looked at the celestial engine, still calculating, still tracking the silent courses of the planets, and something in his expression shifted from tension to something more complicated. He lowered the pistol. "The engine," he said, "took 30 years to become possible and 6 months to build. Fitch was the only man in England who could have made it." "I know," said Holmes. "When something like this is destroyed or lost, something made with that quality of attention, that quality of knowledge, it doesn't come back. There is no equivalent. There is only the loss." Holmes was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "there isn't." The police came in through the door 40 seconds later. Chapter 9. The final explanation. There is a particular quality to the last evening of a case. After the arrests have been made, after the immediate urgency has been resolved, before the formal processes of justice begin their slower work. A quality of accumulated understanding settling into its final shape, the way a piece of machinery sounds different when all its components are in proper alignment. We were at Baker Street that evening, with the fire burning and the fog pressing against the windows and a bottle of claret that Holmes had produced from some recess of his domestic arrangements. I had my notebook. Holmes had his pipe and the expression of a man completing a satisfying calculation. "Tell me the whole of it," I said. Holmes settled back. "The celestial engine was ordered twice," he said. "First by the Austro-Hungarian Naval Observatory, through their agent Weiss. Mrs. Strand, who had intelligence contacts within the Viennese procurement system, became aware of the commission and saw an opportunity. She arranged for Weiss to be neutralized, not killed, simply delayed and discredited, and then approached Fitch directly with a better offer from what appeared to be an independent scientific institution. "The Swiss cover," I said. "The Swiss cover." Fitch accepted. The commission proceeded. At some point, either from the beginning or as a later development, Mrs. Strand's buyer turned out to be acting for Russian naval intelligence. Whether Mrs. Strand knew this from the start or discovered it later, I cannot say with certainty. Her account suggests the latter, though I am not certain I entirely believe her. And the secondary mechanism? Was specified by whoever was operating through Mrs. Strand. Most likely the Russian intelligence contact directly. The purpose was twofold. First, the electromagnetic discharge would destroy all evidence of timing in the workshop, creating a scene with no clear time of death and no indication of when the theft had occurred. Second, Holmes paused. There may have been an intention to ensure Fitch could not subsequently describe the secondary mechanism to anyone. "A man who builds a device without understanding its full function is a liability if the device is later investigated. They planned to kill him all along." Holmes was quiet for a moment. "I believe the discharge was intended to incapacitate him rather than kill him. The person who gave Mrs. Strand the medical assessment of Fitch's health either made an honest error or, and this I consider more likely, deliberately misinformed her, knowing that the discharge would be fatal. Someone in the chain wanted both Fitch and Mrs. Strand to face consequences. Fitch dead, Mrs. Strand implicated in a death she had not intended. A clean disposal of multiple inconvenient parties, I said. Intelligence operations tend to value clean disposals. It is one of the things about that world that I find most repugnant and most rational simultaneously. I considered the whole picture. "The clocks," I said. "The 237 stopped clocks. It was meant to look mysterious, to send the investigation in the wrong direction. It was meant to eliminate all temporal evidence from the crime scene, yes. The effect was certainly mysterious. Perhaps more than intended. Fitch was a thorough craftsman. The coil he built was more powerful than the specifications required." A faint note of what might have been reluctant admiration entered Holmes's voice. "He built it well. He built everything well." That was the tragedy, and the instrument of it simultaneously. "And the engine itself?" "Currently under Mycroft's authority in a secure location. The diplomatic negotiations regarding its eventual disposition will take some months. Weiss has a reasonable claim on behalf of Vienna. The Russians have no official claim at all, which makes their case diplomatically awkward and practically invisible. I suspect the engine will eventually go to some neutral scientific institution. Possibly, in fact, the Swiss one that was used as cover, which has the advantage of actually wanting it for legitimate astronomical research." "Fitch would have appreciated that," I said. "Fitch would have preferred to be alive and admired for it," said Holmes. "But yes, as consolations go, it is better than most." He refilled his pipe. "Holmes," I said after a moment, "when you first walked into that workshop, before you had looked at anything, before you had examined Fitch, before you had read the notebook, you told Lestrade you wanted to see the clocks first, not the body, the clocks." "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for a long moment, in the way that sometimes preceded a response more honest than usual. "Because the clocks told me something that the body could not. The body told me that a man had died. The clocks told me that something had reached into every mechanism in that room, every device built to measure time, and stopped it. All at once. Simultaneously." He looked at the fire. "There is only one way to stop time for 237 clocks, Watson. You must apply the same force to all of them at the same instant, and that requires either an act of God or a piece of engineering so precise that it constitutes its own kind of miracle." "And that told you what?" "That the person who had done this understood mechanisms at a level approaching Fitch's own level, which meant the crime was constructed from inside the craft, not by a thief, not by a simple poisoner, by someone who spoke the same language as the dead man." Holmes looked up. "That is the cruelest kind of betrayal, Watson, not the stranger who attacks from outside, the colleague who uses your own precision against you." I had nothing to add to that. I wrote it down instead. Epilogue. The proceedings that followed the recovery of the celestial engine occupied the better part of 6 months and involved, by Mycroft's eventual account, 3 foreign governments, 2 commercial lawyers of impressive bilingual capability, and 1 lengthy memorandum from the Greenwich Observatory arguing that the engine should be donated to the nation. The memorandum was politely acknowledged and effectively ignored. Mrs. Eleanor Strand received a sentence of 5 years for her role in the commission, reduced on appeal to 3 on grounds of her cooperation. She served 22 months and was released in the autumn of 1901. Holmes, when I mentioned that she had been seen in Paris the following spring, said only, "She will be careful next time. She is that kind of person." He did not elaborate on what kind of person that was, but I thought I understood. Georg Weiss was quietly returned to Vienna, the Foreign Office managing the arrangement with that particular brand of English discretion which consists of doing something that cannot be acknowledged by pretending that nothing happened. Whether he was received as a hero or a liability, I do not know. I suspect the Austro-Hungarian bureaucracy, like most bureaucracies, was capable of holding both opinions simultaneously. The person who had provided Mrs. Strand with the deliberately inaccurate assessment of Fitch's health, the person who had, in effect, engineered Fitch's death while maintaining enough distance to be plausibly uninvolved, was never formally identified. Mycroft knew, or suspected. He and Holmes had one private conversation on the subject that I was not present for, and afterwards Holmes said nothing about it except, "These things are handled differently at that level. Not better. Differently." I visited Clerkenwell once more, the following spring. The workshop at number 47 had been taken over by a younger clockmaker, a Scotsman named Drummond, who had trained under Fitch for 2 years in the early 1890s, and who had, he told me when I identified myself, always planned to take over the lease eventually. The clocks were all running again, not Fitch's clocks. Those had been sold at auction to fund the estate, and were distributed across London in various private collections. Drummond's own instruments, of good quality, though nothing like the master's. "Do you know the story of the celestial engine?" I asked him. "Everybody in Clerkenwell knows it," he said, "or a version of it." He was winding a small carriage clock, with the unhurried precision of someone for whom a minute is a unit of measurement rather than a unit of anxiety. Fitch was the last of a particular kind. You can still find men who make fine clocks. I hope to be one of them, but that level of precision, that complete absorption in a single object to the exclusion of everything else, I don't know if it produces men like that anymore. I did not have a useful response to that observation. I thanked him and left. Outside on Clerkenwell Road, the afternoon was carrying its usual layered ticking, the accumulated sound of hundreds of mechanisms marking time in the narrow streets, each in its own rhythm, none synchronized with any other. It was, I thought, the sound of time as it actually was, diverse, imprecise, gloriously indifferent to the efforts of those who tried to measure it. Holmes, when I described this thought to him that evening, said, "The clocks are not measuring time, Watson. They are measuring the intervals between their own escapements. Time itself is not measured, it is only endured." I wrote that down too. I write everything down. It is the only mechanism I have. Dr. John H. Watson. London, Autumn, 1899. Author's notes. The Clockmaker's Last Second is an original story, the 7th contribution to the Sherlock Holmes series by Reginald Musgrave for Omniversal Editions. All characters, Cornelius Fitch, Thomas Hale, Mrs. Eleanor Strand, Georg Weiss, and all others, are entirely the product of the author's imagination and bear no resemblance to real persons. The Clerkenwell district of London was, in the Victorian era, genuinely the centre of the British clockmaking trade. The Clerkenwell trade was a term of art in the horological world, referring to the cluster of specialised craftsmen who produced components and complete timepieces in the narrow streets around St. John's Lane and Rosebery Avenue. At its peak in the 1880s, the area housed several thousand horological craftsmen working in an intricate ecosystem of specialised production. Astronomical clocks of great precision were produced in England throughout the Victorian period, with notable examples held by the Greenwich Observatory, the Royal Society, and several private collections. The concept of an astronomical clock, capable of the precision described for the fictional celestial engine, is speculative for the 1890s, though not entirely without basis. The late 19th century saw extraordinary advances in precision timekeeping, driven partly by the needs of navigation and partly by the competitive pride of master craftsmen. The use of electromagnetic pulses to interrupt mechanical clock mechanisms is a real phenomenon, though the specific application described in this story, a precision-timed discharge coil built into a clock for this purpose, is fictional. The broader principle of electromagnetic interference with mechanical timekeeping was understood in principle by Victorian physicists, if not yet applied in the way this story imagines. The political background of the story: Austro-Hungarian naval procurement, the Baltic Fleet's operational requirements, the role of independent brokers in the movement of strategic technical equipment, is invented, though consistent with what we know of the intelligence landscape of late Victorian Europe. Reginald Musgrave, Omniversal Editions. And so ends The Clockmaker's Last Second, the seventh adventure of Sherlock Holmes, written by Reginald Musgrave for Omniversal Editions. A story about precision and betrayal, about a man who spent a lifetime measuring time with extraordinary accuracy and was defeated by a mechanism he himself had built. About the particular cruelty of being destroyed through your own expertise, having your greatest quality turned against you by someone who understood it well enough to use it as a weapon. And about Holmes standing in a room full of stopped clocks, asking not who was dead, but what had stopped them. Because the clocks, he knew, would tell him more than the body ever could. This is the seventh audiobook in the series. The previous six: The Orchestra of the Devil, The Iron Widow, The House of 1,000 Mirrors, The Dead Man's Sentence, The Ship of Nobody, and The Painter of Corpses, are available on this channel and on Amazon KDP as part of the Reginald Musgrave series for Omniversal Editions. 3 in Italian, 1 in Spanish, and now 2 in English, because good mysteries, like good clocks, should work in any language. If this story has kept you company, kept you guessing, made these 2.5 hours pass with something approaching pleasure, a like, a subscription, a comment. Tell me which moment surprised you most. Tell me which character stayed with you longest. We will be back. With more clocks, more locked rooms, more fog-wrapped London streets, more of that singular mind working at full power. Until the next story, good listening, good reading, and good investigating. Your narrator. The Clockmaker's Last Second, a Sherlock Holmes adventure. Author, Reginald Musgrave. Publisher, Omniversal Editions. omniversal.author@gmail.com. Audiobook edition. Text for professional narration. Omniversal Editions. All rights reserved. Any unauthorized reproduction is strictly prohibited.